Human memory is notoriously unreliable, which can be problematic given that eyewitness testimony is one of the cornerstones of most legal systems across the globe. Our memories tend to be particularly poor when it comes to details, and naturally this is true of our memories of football. You'll also find that football fans tend to exaggerate the good or the bad in their minds. So, Zinedine Zidane is often considered to the ultimate big game player primarily because of his performances in the 1998 World Cup final, at Euro 2000, and in the 2002 Champions League final. People tend to be less quick to recall Zizou's much quieter Champions League final in 1997, how it was dominated by Roy Keane in the 1999 semi-final, and how damaging his red card was to France in the 2006 World Cup final. Our minds play tricks with us. We all do it. In a similar vein, subscriber Nobody Cares spent much of last month asking me to do a video looking at some players who didn't score as many goals as a lot of people seem to think. Before I start, I just want to say that I won't be including Didier Drogba because I discussed his slightly less prolific record than some perceived almost 3 years ago, and it's been pretty widely covered ever since, so I would say Drogba's output is no longer of enormous surprise to most of you who watch the videos on this channel. Okay. Here are 7 footballers who probably scored fewer goals than you think. Peter Crouch. Peter Crouch holds a couple of distinctions of which he is rightly very proud, most notably the fact that he is among the so-called Premier League 100 club and he holds the record for the most headed goals during the Premier League era. There are only 28 players who have bagged 100 plus goals in the top flight of English football since 1992. And Crouch is one of them. Meanwhile, his record for headed goals was one which he poached from the highest scoring player of the Premier League era, Alan Shearer. In total, Crouch scored 108 goals in 468 games, a record which included goals for Aston Villa, Southampton, Liverpool, Portsmouth, Tottenham and Stoke. That means Crouch scored in the Premier League at a rate of 0.23 goals per game, which means he scored goals at half the rate of Michael Owen or Romelu Lukaku and a third of the rate of Harry Kane, Sergio Aguero and Thierry Henry. Now, those are some pretty handy players I've just mentioned there, but to be 2 or 3 times more prolific than someone else is pretty emphatic. Crouch has an almost identical goals per game record in the Premier League to Emile Heskey, who was routinely the butt of many jokes about his lack of goals, yet the same criticisms were rarely aimed at the 6'7" podcast host. Perhaps it is because Crouch was more prolific for England, with whom he averaged better than 0.5 goals per game, whilst Heskey only scored 1 more goal for England than John Terry. Luis Figo. Wingers of the 21st century have somewhat distorted what was once considered impressive numbers when it comes to goal-scoring output for a wide player. Whilst obviously Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo, whilst playing on the right and left flanks respectively, recorded almost unprecedented numbers of goals, the likes of Raheem Sterling, Mohamed Salah and Sadio Mane here in the Premier League have all contributed to the idea that an elite wide man ought to be able to hit 20 plus goals a season across all competitions. That hasn't always been the case, and Luis Figo never once in his career had a 20-goal season. The closest the Portuguese maestro came was in his last season at Barcelona and in his first season with Real Madrid, scoring 14 goals in each of those campaigns. Of course, that is not to say that Figo was not as good as the leading contemporary players in his position. It is more a case of the game evolving, formations changing, and expectations and duties in different positions shifting. At the turn of the millennium, with Ronaldo out injured, Luis Figo was, very briefly at least, the best footballer on earth. Nevertheless, his career goal-scoring record of 133 goals from 795 games, which is under 0.17 goals per game, is fewer than former Real Madrid teammates like David Beckham and even centre-back and defensive midfielder Fernando Hierro. Dennis Bergkamp. I think most people appreciate that Dennis Bergkamp was a great player, despite never coming particularly close to winning the Premier League Golden Boot. A little like Roberto Firmino now, Bergkamp was a centre-forward whose game was about far more than simply scoring goals. In fact, the non-flying Dutchman actually recorded more assists than goals during his time in the Premier League. There was a time when Bergkamp was remarkably prolific, and that was in the Eredivisie in his last 3 seasons with Ajax. During his 13 seasons after leaving Ajax though, 2 spent with Inter Milan and 11 at Arsenal, Bergkamp only once managed more than 12 league goals. In his most prolific campaign outside of the Netherlands, the 1990 Dutch Footballer of the Year, bagged 22 goals in all competitions. Meanwhile, there were 6 seasons in which he failed to reach double figures for goals in all competitions. When he did find the back of the net, Bergkamp tended to score brilliant goals, and it's often the highlights reel type players who lead to the most commonly held misconceptions. In the Premier League, Bergkamp averaged 0.27 goals per game, a ratio which is bettered by the likes of Dion Dublin, Darren Bent and Olivier Giroud. Jermain Defoe. Well, we've already had Peter Crouch in this 7, so we might as well make him feel at home with his favourite strike partner. Unlike the others in this 7 so far, Jermain Defoe was a goalscorer, and by that I mean his primary responsibility on a football pitch was, and indeed still is, to score goals. Defoe has an excellent reputation within the English game as being one of the most reliable goalscorers out there, and don't get me wrong, Defoe has certainly scored plenty of goals. However, I still think there may be a bit of a mismatch between how prolific most people think Jermain Defoe was and how prolific he actually was. As I tweeted a while back, I watched a piece on BT Sport with Peter Crouch and Joe Cole talking about how they couldn't believe Fabio Capello didn't take Defoe to the World Cup in 2006, since he was, quote, on fire that season. In truth, Defoe had only scored 9 goals in 38 games that season, and he had scored just 1 in 12 prior to the finals in Germany. Over his entire career, Defoe never scored 20 plus league goals in a season, and only twice did he reach that landmark in all competitions. Defoe's overall career goal tally is still high, largely because of his consistency and longevity, having broken through young and still playing top-flight football well into his 30s. The fact remains that he was actually less prolific than the aforementioned trio of Dublin, Bent and Giroud, as well as being outscored on a per-game basis by his old teammate Robbie Keane, and I suspect that will come as a surprise to a lot of people. Stanley Matthews. Stanley Matthews is considered by almost all of his contemporaries to be either the best or at the very least one of the best footballers of all time. As I said when discussing Luis Figo, the expectation for elite wingers in terms of goal scoring has been distorted in recent times, but it wasn't that unusual for wide men to score plenty of goals in Matthews' day. Tom Finney, for example, Matthews' old England pal, hit 28 goals in his most prolific campaign and averaged almost a goal every other game. Matthews, meanwhile, never scored 20 plus goals in a season and averaged a miserly 1 goal every 10 games across his entire career, or 0.1 goals per game for those of you who prefer decimals. Well, there you have it then. Clearly, Matthews is one of the most historically overrated footballers of all time, he couldn't hit a barn door, and Finney was his superior. Well, not quite. Sir Stan's numbers may look underwhelming, but the player most certainly was not. Assist stats were not recorded during Matthews' era, or indeed prior to the last 20-ish years, but if they were, it is my suspicion that Matthews would be the most creative footballer of all time. There's a reason why, whilst both played on the right at club level, it was Matthews who played in his preferred position for England, and Finney pushed out to the left. In an era of goal scorers, Matthews was world football's finest creator, not just of his era, but possibly of all time. Paolo Rossi. A quick glance at Paolo Rossi's CV makes for immediately impressive reading. A Ballon d'Or, a World Cup Golden Boot, a World Cup Golden Ball, and a Serie A Golden Boot. Clearly, we are dealing with one of the most prolific marksmen of all time. Well, not quite. We're actually dealing with one of the most prolific marksmen of 1982, which is when Rossi received every one of those individual accolades for the only time in his career. Paolo Rossi was a man who relished the big occasions, most notably the World Cup. His 2 finest moments in football came at the finals in 1978 and 1982, and Rossi scored as many goals at the World Cup as Christian Vieri and Eusebio. To the international community then, at a time when the world was much smaller and football was broadcast a lot less, Rossi was one of world football's leading centre-forwards. In truth, whilst Rossi was undoubtedly a very capable centre-forward, he was certainly no Eusebio or Christian Vieri. He only ever had one 20-plus goal season in Serie A, which was his first season in Italy's top flight, and he only reached double figures in Serie A on 4 occasions. Rossi averaged fewer than 0.4 goals per game in Serie A, despite his starring performances and major international finals, and I could just as easily have included fellow Italian World Cup star Salvatore Schillaci, who only actually had 1 decent season in Italy's top flight, despite his heroics at Italia 90. Andres Iniesta. Last but not least, I don't think many people think Andres Iniesta was particularly prolific, but I think most people would still be surprised by just how few goals he scored in total. For a player who tended to play in quite an advanced role, with plenty of freedom for both club and country, with this club and country being the best club and international sides on earth at times, Iniesta's goal-scoring output was incredibly modest. In La Liga, for example, across 16 seasons in Spain's top flight, Iniesta scored only 35 goals, an average of roughly 2 goals a season. In all competitions, the midfield magician bagged 57 goals in 674 appearances, an average of 0.08 goals per game, the lowest of any player in this 7. Iniesta did score some immensely important goals, such as his late winner against Chelsea for Barcelona in the 2009 Champions League semi-final and his even later winner for Spain against the Netherlands in the 2010 World Cup final. Again, perhaps those big moments distort the bigger picture, but the fact remains that whilst he is one of the finest players of his generation, Iniesta was less prolific than Mark Noble. That's it for today's video. Thank you as ever for watching. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, make sure that you are subscribed to HITC Sevens.